Hello, and welcome to this episode of Mining Matters, a part of the In Dialogue series hosted by the Non-Fuel Minerals and Mining Research Team, led by Dr. Rajesh Chadha at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, New Delhi. We invite experts from India and abroad to discuss how India's mining sector can become a catalyst for economic growth and development, ensuring fair and sustainable mining practices for the environment and affected communities.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Mining Matters. Today, I am joined with Mr. Ranjan Mathai. Mr. Ranjan Mathai is an Indian civil servant of the Indian Forest Service cadre. In his illustrious career, Mr. Mathai has served in various Indian embassies, including in Vienna, Colombo, Washington, Tehran, and Brussels. He has also been the ambassador to France, Israel, and Qatar, before serving as the Indian Foreign Secretary from August 2011 to July 2013. Mr. Mathai has also served as the High Commissioner of India to the United Kingdom from December 2013 to October 2015. Mr. Mathai has been speaking about and writing on the importance of mining to India's national security and economy for the past several years. And we're really glad to have him with us in this third episode of Mining Matters to discuss the need to ensure resilient supply chains of minerals and metals, which are the essential inputs required for India's manufacturing ambitions and climate change mitigation goals. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Mathai.
Delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Great. So to start with, I'd just like to set the context about the topic of our discussion today, which is going to be on critical minerals, also known as critical raw materials. It's become a hot topic quite recently, especially in line with our climate change mitigation targets. So just to start with, critical minerals are the raw materials that are the essential inputs for the industrial security sector, and also very important for national security purposes. These minerals tend to have high risks in their supply chain disruptions, and the demand for many of these minerals are expected to rise rapidly over the next 2 or 3 decades, especially in line with the requirements for wind turbines, solar panels, and EVs. And this rapidly increasing demand may disrupt existing supply chains. So while the conversation on critical minerals has been intensifying quite recently, you've been a voice on this topic for several years. And I think I've seen some of your op-eds from 3 or 4 years ago, which has been highlighting the importance of critical minerals for India. So just to start the question, what brought this issue to your attention so much before the topic has been discussed more widely today?
Well, thank you, Ganesh. I would say you summed up precisely the reasons why I got interested in this. Basically, the importance, the essentiality of critical minerals for industrialization of our country and national security. If you add energy security to the mix, which is what is being done now, then the subject of critical minerals becomes of clear interest to anyone involved with foreign policy or national security. At least that's the way I always felt and I saw it. I was initially drawn to the subject of oil and oil resources, which are inextricably linked to the history of global diplomacy in the 20th century. And critical minerals are, in a sense, being added to the resources which are critical to our future. But I must say that even before venturing into diplomacy, I had an interest in this because if you read Indian history, particularly economic history, you find that we have had over centuries quite a remarkable record in both mining and metallurgy. And why it is that we haven't been able to keep this up when we are an industrializing country with control over our own destiny was not very, very clear to me. And particularly, I say this given our geological potential, which is very substantial. As our manufacturing base has expanded, the dependence on foreign-sourced minerals keeps growing. Managing such import requirements requires us to have much larger purchasing power and sources of supply. But when your declared intention is to move ahead as a self-reliant nation, and particularly now when we are trying to build our defense industries to supply the armed forces on a self-reliant basis, the need for critical inputs becomes a matter of national security and which cannot be ignored. And I would say, in summing it up, replacing dependence on the Gulf for oil to dependence on China for the new energy inputs is a recipe for disaster. So I was also struck by how little awareness there was about what the world's major economic powers were actually doing to secure critical mineral availability and reserves. The United States, under President Trump, came out with a detailed strategy a few months after he took over. And one of the things it did was to revive a strategic mineral stockpile, which was created after the Second World War, and which was then and now is managed by the Defense Logistic Agency of the Pentagon. China has had a critical mineral strategy since 2003. And if you go back to its 863 program of blueprint of 1986, you can see already that their planners were thinking about the importance, particularly of rare earths. Japan learned to its great cost the importance of mineral security in 2010-11, when China cut off rare earth supplies. And presently, JOGMEC, that is Japan Oil, Gas, Mineral, which is a public sector company, maintains a stockpile of 60 days requirement of 34 key minerals and metals. South Korea also has started creating a mineral stockpile with a lot of dependence on the private sector. European countries rely more on increasing domestic mining and diversifying foreign supplies and enhancing supply chain security. But the EU has updated its critical mineral strategy and passed a law on the issue last year. Meanwhile, the OECD and the International Energy Agency are studying critical minerals for green transition. And even NATO has looked at supply chain security, including metals. So after I had retired and started presenting my views publicly, I began to highlight the issue of critical minerals to draw public attention to them. This was, as you noted, many years ago. I actually started 5 years ago. And I'm glad that there is presently so much more public awareness about minerals. And I hope I've contributed to this in some modest way.
Thank you so much. And you absolutely have. I think the early days of doing critical minerals work at CSEP, there were probably 3 or 4 key references we could find, one of which was your voice on the matter for the years preceding. So it's really nice to know that there are people doing this work from such an early start. And from some of the other reading I've done, I can see that India has been looking at critical mineral strategies for a while now. I think in 2011, we had the Planning Commission Working Group,
Yes.
and some discussions on this, even as far back as the 70s or 80s, at least whispers of rare earths and so on. But I think just setting a bit more context based on what you were mentioning with China cutting off the supply of rare earths to Japan. I think this to set context to any other listener. The supply chains of critical minerals are actually quite concentrated in a handful of countries. And they can be concentrated both on the extraction side, that is the mining side, or the processing side, where the minerals are then converted into maybe a chemical compound or any form that's then ready to be used in the final products. So Congo, the DR Congo, for example, extracts about 69% of the global supply of cobalt, while China actually processes 65% of the supply. Likewise, Australia mines 52% of lithium, while China again has a monopoly on a 58% share of the processing. So what would you say are some of the strategies that India can employ to secure our critical mineral needs? And maybe also, I think I could have brought this up earlier, but how critical minerals are also going to be more essential now, as I was mentioning, the demand for minerals is set to rise with our climate change mitigation targets. And you were also referring to perhaps in a way the new oil, in that this is going to be where the energy comes from in our solar panels or energy storage in our batteries. So given the increasing need for critical minerals for energy, what are some of the strategies that India can employ, like the US, South Korea, or Japan have done, or NATO is doing?
Well, let me start by expanding a little on what you brought up, and that is the critical importance of minerals for the energy transition or the climate change mitigation. It needs to be, I think, understood that critical minerals have become critical because of the specific path that we and the rest of the world have chosen for decarbonization and energy transition. That is the shift away from fossil fuels to renewables. And this is primarily based on solar and wind power, electric vehicles and battery storage, and now hydrogen as a liquid fuel. The sun and the wind, as we all know, generate energy, but converting them into usable power is something else. And this is where critical minerals, which have specific electronic, optical, or magnetic properties, are used in the process of converting natural energy into usable power. They become critical as they enhance electrical conductivity, light absorption, and they add generation efficiencies as well as durability to the items, whether they're solar panels or they're rooftop solar or they're wind turbines with permanent magnets and so on. The catalysts used for hydrogen also presently use very expensive and rare metals like platinum and iridium. Batteries have always required special minerals, but in EVs, they are the main source of power and therefore they require very large amounts of minerals. And this sheer demand for these metals is making them into critical minerals. Now, what are some of the strategies which India can employ to reduce risks in the supplies? First and foremost, I believe India should identify and explore minerals on its own territory. As far as critical minerals are concerned, the task should be facilitated, I believe, by setting up working groups of central and state governments with the private sector. Secondly, India should buy into mineral reserves in foreign countries after having gone through the exercise of trying to identify them on your own territory. And I think we should choose particularly countries with a track record of mining, where resources have been explored and identified as economically viable. Third, I think time has come for us to consider a strategic mineral stockpile, as has been done by some other countries. And we have a model in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Fourthly, I think we should be part of supply chain linkages with friendly foreign countries. And we should be involved, I believe also, and this is one very important issue which we need to take note of, we should be involved in the global R&D efforts which are underway to find alternatives to critical minerals, which are necessary for energy transition and strategically important industries. So I think it's a mix of all these elements which would go into a strategy for India.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I think CSIP is trying to do its part in at least identifying which minerals are the most critical and which the government could put some focus on for the strategy to start with, at least.
Can I come in here? I think CSIP is
please.
also doing one very other important point since I have been involved, and that is you're involving both the central and the state governments, because particularly your studies of mining attractiveness index and so on. I think it's important for us to now create a kind of mechanism by which industry can interact with both state and central governments on a single platform when critical minerals are involved.
Absolutely. And especially given that mining anyway is on the concurrent list, having all the stakeholders involved makes it much easier for industry to participate in the sector here. So just on that, we recently heard the good news from the Geological Survey of India, where we found some lithium in Jammu and Kashmir. And there's been a lot of talk about how this can really give us a big bolster in our critical mineral security needs, especially for battery manufacturing. But one aspect of the supply chain that is still amiss in India is the processing part. Even if we have the ore of lithium, getting the lithium ore into usable forms like cathodes and anodes for batteries requires a lot of technology and expertise, which we don't yet have. And as mentioned earlier, China dominates with about 60% share in lithium processing. So the question I have is, should India get involved in processing, given the impacts it may have on the environment? It's quite water intensive, and on the communities around it in terms of their health. And if so, if it is worthwhile to bring in the industry here, What are some of the steps to enable such a industry to set up in India?
Well, I certainly think India can and it should process critical minerals, including lithium. It is, after all, the refined or processed minerals which are made into, as you said, compounds or metals, which are actually used in industry. And in a crisis, dependence on foreign suppliers of these materials carries both geopolitical and financial risks. It's no good having an ore available even when you bring it above the surface if it can't be used immediately. The vulnerability to reliance on China for rare earth elements processed for use is one that many countries have woken up to. And I hope you and I are not boys crying wolf and to find that, we should have woken up to this earlier.
No, I mean, Japan already has faced the wrath, so it's the evidence is there.
But there is another aspect to this, and this is again something I have tried to write on, and that there are many minor minerals which are used, say, in solar panels, which are rarely found in mineable quantities as standalone minerals. But they can be efficiently extracted in refining and processing of other minerals. For example, when you do zinc refining, you can extract cadmium and indium. Similarly, from copper, you can extract tellurium, and from bauxite, gallium. And all these are identified as critical for the solar industry, particularly for thin film solar PV. It's clearly, and indeed for electronics and for defense targeting mechanisms and so on. It is clearly understood that processing minerals is both cost intensive, it is polluting, and sometimes can be hazardous. So we have to incentivize mineral processing through appropriate tax and royalty regimes. At the same time, we need public-private partnership to ensure that industry adheres to scientifically established standards for environmental safety and minimizes hazards and risks in industrial safety. India should also give, I believe, incentives for foreign direct investment in mineral processing in the country, which will not only give us strategic leverage, but economic benefits through value addition to our own resources. I'll give you an example. If you go back to the era of oil, now, even when you find oil, you need actual petrol to put in your vehicles. Having created a very large and sophisticated refining industry in our country, we not only meet our own needs, we actually export refined products. And this has given us both financial and diplomatic leverage. Now, I believe, going back to critical minerals, we lost, or we have delayed very seriously, the opportunity of building a joint venture with Japan for processing rare earths. Japan finally packed up and went away to Malaysia. We did sign a subsequent agreement, and we are supplying rare earths to Japan, but the processing is not done in our country. At least it isn't being done now. As new efforts are underway to build friendly supply chains, mineral security should be a key factor, I believe, in our diplomatic outreaches. We can join coalitions both as supplier and as an importer. Mineral Security Partnership, which was set up by 14 countries. I've written about that.
Yes.
I think that's also something worth looking at closely. Mm-hmm. If not that particular group of 14 countries, we can set up other coalitions of the similar kind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll come back to that in a second, because I think with your foreign policy hat as well, you'll be able to tell us a bit more on that. But before I do, I think just to extend the last question I had, and also in line with what you were saying about the potential for some of these minor minerals to be extracted from the waste streams. So with let's say the lithium found in Kashmir, it is 5.9 million tons of inferred resources. And the government wants to bring that out into auctions sometime this year. Are you aware of any other minerals that are perhaps low-hanging fruits or other critical minerals that we could quite easily get the mining started here in India relatively soon? Is there anything else that we're missing out on at the moment?
Well, I wouldn't describe them as low-hanging fruit because when you come to mining as an industry and mineral extraction and processing, you're talking of a minimum of 5 to 7 years lead time uh, for any kind of successful outcome. So let's say that we need to start. I believe most experts agree that India has great geological potential for a whole range of minerals and can substantially increase its output. We share, after all, many geological traits with both Australia and the southern part of Africa, both of which are powerhouses in the mining world. However, according to analysts, only 10% of India's obvious geological potential has been adequately explored, and only 2% has actually reached the stage of mining. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. Now, mining does come with environmental and social costs, but then so does any kind of industrial activity, as indeed agribusiness or even intensive animal husbandry, as we are finding out in the era of climate change awareness. The task before us in India, I believe, is to balance the costs with the essentiality of meeting human needs for energy, and above all, for ending poverty in our country. Our energy consumption on a per capita basis is 1/6 of the average for the whole world. So I think this has to be the central message. We have to end this poverty and we must start at home. But what is the alternative? To rely only on imports of essential minerals? Our experience with oil and even coal today points to the pitfalls of such a strategy. Foreign exchange outflows will burden the balance of payments, supply risks and vulnerabilities will pose threats to you, and there will be, above all, a missed opportunity for creating a self-reliant industrial base in your own country. Mining contributes only 1.5 to 2% of India's GDP, whereas it's 7.5 to 12% in other mining jurisdictions of some sophistication like South Africa and Australia. So obviously, we have to walk the extra mile to minimize the environmental and social costs. There are best-in-class practices from around the world which we need to emulate, if not exceed, given that we have a larger population and that on many of the sites rich in minerals, there are marginalized communities. And we need to protect our natural environment on which so much else depends, far more, I think, than other countries need to. So mine operators must start with what one of your previous interlocutors described as an end of mine plan. What is going to happen to this site when you're finished with the mining? Will it be restored to its pristine state, or will it at least be restored in a way that human habitation can continue and other activities can continue? Mining companies can be encouraged to expand their CSR activities beyond what is being done now, to actually, through tax benefits maybe, through investing in skilling of youths in nearby areas, in addition to socially beneficial projects. Local communities have to be made stakeholders in the overall environment of mining. If there is a move in mineral prices and profits, we can even consider a sovereign wealth fund at a later stage. So I think this is a path we need to go down to. We cannot shy away from the responsibility of taking on greater responsibility for our own energy requirements, our own industrial requirements, and our own security requirements.
Thank you. I think that's something that we have been working on as well. And as you had mentioned, the work we've done on sustainable mining attractiveness, there are so many examples of mining ecosystems being created in India, which are run with good practices from around the world, imbibed, so that the community can be engaged and benefit from what the mine can offer. But of course, there are unfortunate examples too on the other side where communities and environment have been severely neglected. Having said that, given that mining will be continuing in India and we do want to see a vibrant industry being built which meets our domestic needs, especially for critical minerals, I wanted to just quickly talk about the allocation system in India. This is something that we have spoken about before as well. And this is about the auction system that was implemented in 2015. The auction system is the means of allocating mining resources in India right now. And it came after a verdict by the Supreme Court that an allocation system must follow the principles of fairness, objectivity, and transparency. So the government did bring in amendments to the mining laws such that auctions are the way forward, where companies who are interested would have to make bids, and the bid would indicate what the revenue sharing would be of the minerals they mine. We noticed in one of our papers some issues with the mining system till date, especially with many bids being irrationally high, in some cases higher than the value of the mineral itself. And to that end, we were a bit concerned, would the auction system or the current mining policy framework, is it enough to incentivize more private investment? And as you said, foreign direct investment, the exploration companies, are they all incentivized to come to India to mine critical minerals, perhaps also the seabed minerals? And what can be done in the policy framework to make it a bit more competitive compared to the other countries out there?
No, I think, on the auction process, CSEP's work, I think, is almost unique. I haven't come across such excellent research anywhere else, and I have very little to add to this. There are a number of reasons which we believe have led to this distortion of the process, which the auctions were supposed to solve. I don't think I need to add much to that. But I think there are models from other countries, other mining jurisdictions, particularly democratic countries, which have faced similar issues regarding, capture of resources and so on, and dealt with them both judicially and administratively. And I think we can learn particularly from some of those. And I think this is going to be particularly critical now when, as in 2015, the mining policy clearly recognized that exploration and extraction of mining is going to move away from surface to deep underground mining. And this, when you were talking about deep underground mining or just underground mining, it is both costly and time intensive. The allocation process, therefore, has to be transparent, and it should prevent resource capture through effectively monitored minimum work programs with time-bound targets for monetizing the resource or handing it back. So I think we need to work on some kind of a model for that. But at the same time, we need to recognize the public part of it, that there have to be time-bound regulatory clearances and a realistic understanding of boom and bust tendencies in the mineral markets, so that what's very attractive one year may not be as attractive to maintain the same level of production the next year. I think the open acreage license policy, which has been started for oil, can be extrapolated in some form to particularly for the exploration companies, as you mentioned, the so-called juniors who are willing to invest money in pure exploration. And when you're talking about deep underground mining, one should also recognize that in the allocation auction process or allocation process, whatever it is, if the vein of minerals extends beyond what is evident when you do the assaying from above ground, extends beyond that limit, you should, I think, have mechanisms by which industry can extend their mining license beyond the territory fixed above ground. Seabed mining is another kettle of fish, to use an old metaphor. This is something which is just starting, and I think we'll need to tackle that as we go along. Just now, it seems rather expensive, and there is a lot of controversy over whether we should go in for it just now. But I think I believe that it would be very advantageous to India to invite and incentivize exploration companies who have very, very advanced techniques for identifying minerals underground. Just the fact that you have identified and created the idea that the potential is there will bring serious investors to your door. And we have a very large number of companies with very sophisticated mining capabilities in our own country. So I think it would be beneficial for everyone if we were able to do this.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting. And I think your point on the how there may be veins of minerals that pass the the area that's allocated to a company. I think that's quite important, and it requires a lot of I think forward-looking thinking on how to make sure that we are using our resources efficiently. You don't want to have
if I can come in, I think
Sure,
here
sure.
again, we have had some controversies over oil and gas.
Mhm.
There have been arguments that, people are extracting from beyond the license area. Now, if there is somebody else's license immediately next door, obviously there is going to be an issue.
Right.
But if there isn't,
Yeah.
I think as practical policymakers, our government should think in terms of incentivizing this ability to extract from one place. Gives you huge advantages of cost and time.
Exactly.
In monetizing resources which are critical to your industry and to your security.
Yeah. And it also helps reduce the impact on environment. Instead of having to start a new mining project, if you're able
Yes.
to extend an already sanctioned mining project, which has all the clearances, it makes a lot more sense to just use that and go ahead and make the best use of the resources available. So I think maybe I'll just take a step back. There are a couple of points you had raised, which I found really interesting and wanted to explore it further with you. The first one being on stockpiles. You had mentioned the stockpiling system that's recently started in the US and also exists in Japan and South Korea. One thing that you had also said is sorry, maybe I'm misremembering, but I think you were mentioning how South Korea is working with the private sector and Japan has a 60-day stockpile. So along those lines, you think it's feasible for India to also have its own stockpile domestically in terms of the economic feasibility? And secondly, if not, is there any scope for something along the lines of friend-shoring, where instead of having a single national stockpile, we work with like-minded partner countries where each contributes the minerals that are found in those countries, processed in those countries, and have some sort of collective stockpile? Is that also something that's feasible with partnership with other countries?
Yes, I think it is. But let me just start by clarifying. The United States actually started its strategic mineral stockpile just after the Second World War.
Right.
What President Trump did was to revive it. It had gone into a phase in the late 90s and early 2000s where it was not seen as important as earlier. And he revived that, and that is run by the Pentagon. But both Japan and South Korea have different models. And they have a combination of a government JOGMEC in Japan, managed stockpile, plus certain mandatory stockpiles which are maintained by industry for certain minerals. And South Korea, I think, is relying more on that industry-led model, so that the industries already have warehousing and stockpiling and safe maintenance capabilities for minerals. So just allocate a part of that as being available in terms of a crisis to the nation at large. I mean, if you look at oil, for example, I mean, one of the great achievements, we had virtually no strategic oil reserves in the 1990 when we had one big crisis. Today, we have built up a reserve which has perhaps got 15 to 20 days consumption availability. But our oil refinery have grown so large that they maintain stocks which will see us through at least a month if everything else is cut off. So it's a combination, the government and the industry, between them can create this.
Okay, but so what you have mentioned, has responsibility too.
Yes, I mean, you have to have some kind of mandatory allocation quota in case of a crisis. That yes, okay, 10% of your stock you are maintaining for your own industry, but 10% of that will be available in the event of a national crisis. And industry does understand this. I don't think they see it as a burden.
Okay.
But if I may come to the point about friend-shoring, I think this is a very good model. After all, the availability of minerals depends on geology, and there are different geologies around the world. And I believe a start has already been made. United States, Australia has a very strong partnership, UK, Australia, Canada. Perhaps Japan is also getting into some of these friend-shoring arrangements. So I think this is a way we need to go. We need to tie up with some friendly foreign countries because it is not just the mineral, but sometimes the processed mineral that you might need to have available at short notice. So I think there are a very large number of opportunities out there. We need to make this part of our diplomacy and our diplomatic outreach.
Great. And I think probably my last question, very similar point. You were mentioning the partnerships that exist already with the Mineral Security Partnership of 14 countries and the ties between US, Australia, the UK, Canada. Unfortunately, India has missed out on the Mineral Security Partnership, which I believe seems to be a group of developed countries, OECD countries. So is there any scope of India either starting its own partnership or working with countries, maybe a South-South partnership, using the G20 platform, BIMSTEC, Quad? Is there scope anywhere for India to take leadership for at least the developing countries in the global South?
I think there is an opportunity, but we need to first develop the capabilities. And for that, I think some of our current partnerships, for example, I believe we have gone fairly far down the road with Australia already.
Yep.
So yes, I think but if we can develop that, we'll have models which we can present to the global South. We created this company called Kabil, the public sector companies, which is supposed to invest in resources abroad. They have done some work in Latin America, in South America, and I believe they have done some in Australia. But I think we need to have a more sophisticated approach and see which countries would find it beneficial to have an alternative to the OECD-dominated mining companies or their supply chains, and have not as a complete different model, but as an alternative, so that you can be part of more than one supply chain to increase your options, as it were. India, I believe, should start with African countries where we have good relationships through our technical high-tech programs and our Exim Bank lines of credit and so on. We should start working on some models in Southern Africa, East Africa, for talking at least now about some joint venture or a joint stockpile or a joint arrangement for sharing of critical minerals.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned the lines of credit. I remember hearing or reading somewhere that there were even discussions on exchanging critical minerals for lines of credit, as in payment for lines of credit. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to work with African countries and partners there to get our mineral needs. At least before some of the other countries leap in. I think China has a huge foothold in Africa, as does France to an extent, I think. So I think India does have a lot of potential.
Can I come in here? I think that's true, but the model which we could present would be, I think, a more equitable model.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is not been widely known that Chinese companies have in fact started facing intensive resistance. And there have been attacks on Chinese mining companies in the Congo and in DRC and even in other places. So we need a more equitable model where the host country is not just a supplier of metals against a financial transaction, whether it's a line of credit or a purchase agreement, where it's made a stakeholder in developing that capability jointly, and if possible, developing greater value addition on site in that country. That is where the kind of models which we are beginning to look at with the developed countries might serve as a template, where we are not just a provider of raw materials, but we're an equal partner in a necessary element in the energy transition, for example.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think it's all about finding the equitable models which we can use to work with countries in Africa. Thank you so much, Mr. Mathai. That's really helpful. I think I've learned a lot here and would love to take some of this forward in my work as well. Thank you so much for your time and to join us. I think if I can just give you a minute or so, if you have anything else to add, which I may have missed out on, or you have anything else you'd like to say.
No, just this, that I believe the CACP is on the right track. We have a huge opportunity ahead of us. It's full of a great deal of complexities, which we should be aware of upfront. And I think research work is where we are sorely lacking so far. And I think CACP has filled a gap. So I'm very happy to have joined in this session, and we'll be happy to take things forward as and when CACP has anything further to discuss.
Thank you so much once again. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.